I began to learn that Maine, like all apple growing regions, had its own unique assortment of historic apple varieties. Not only that, I began to learn that Maine had varieties that were rarely and sometimes never grown anywhere else. And many of these old Maine apples were on the verge of being lost forever.
Hello, my name is Ria Wincaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
Bringing us into this episode, you heard a little piece from the featured presentation with John Bunker, who is a Maine resident, and he is speaking about the Maine Heritage Orchard, specifically the successes and challenges over the first 10 years. And John was speaking at Maine Apple Camp, and that took place last August of 2022, and this is part of a series I'm rolling out to kick off Season 8 of Cider Chat. Yes, Season 8. We have 7 seasons behind us, over 350 episodes that are all archived at ciderchat.com. So you could go to that website, see all the different Maine featured photos of each guest or each conversation, and find show notes. Also at ciderchat.com, you could find mentions in the chat, such as some of the mentions that I'm going to be talking about in this here episode this week that you're listening to now. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the upcoming conference called CiderCon, which is taking place in Chicago, and also the New York International Cider Competition. But before we get there, I have a letter from Isaac, a new patron at Cider Chat. He writes, I'm happy to become a patron. Not sure what took me so long, as I've been listening for a couple of years now and love the podcast. I'm a rural mail carrier on a 93-mile route, so you can imagine having something to listen to is important. I live in the middle of corn and soybean fields in northwest Indiana. LaPorte County, the region, as they say. I love that, Isaac. Which is traditionally home to several orchards, and one orchard in particular always has a few heirloom varieties of apple. I eat an apple almost every day and started getting interested in tasting varieties we don't have around here. So with the help of YouTube, I learned to graft, and over the last 2 years, me and my boys, Liam, 24, Odin, 24, so it sounds like you got some twins there, and Elijah, 21, have planted over 250 dwarf and semi-dwarf trees. So this led to all the amazing varieties that aren't just for eating, and of course, to cider. I listened to the book, Uncultivated, among others, and of course, found your podcast, which has been multiple O's there, so helpful. My boys already had a budding homebrew hobby, so we bought an apple press we found in rural Illinois from 1875 and pressed our first apples. The cider turned out very funky indeed, but we tried again this year and ended up with 5 different 5-gallon fermenters, all from different trees we found in the area. My country driving habits allows me to search out the trees in the spring when they flower, and I just take notes of their location for the fall. We are actually working with a neighbor to plant an old pasture of his into a small organic cider orchard. We'll be grafting hundreds of trees again this winter, with the idea to supply regional cideries with hard-to-get varieties. Anyways, thank you for all the inspiration and keep up the good work. I absolutely love the recent roundtable discussion in Maine. So helpful. As for particular styles of cider, I've only tried a few, and of course ours. I've liked them all, but I prefer not sweet, and I actually enjoy some with hops and would like to experiment a little with that. We had one get a little funky with some wildies, and I'm learning to enjoy that in small amounts, and would love to taste one aged and blended properly. We decided to run that one through the still, and it made a nice brandy that is now sitting with charred oak staves in it. Let the experiments continue. Isaac. Right on, Isaac. I love this. I just brings a tear to my eye thinking you driving, maybe even today, probably on that 93-mile loop around delivering the mail. You know, that is noble work. I was a mail carrier myself at one point in my life. And keep that on. And dang, you're like spreading that through with your sons and planting the orchard and working it. Like, go Indiana. I love this. This is so poetic for this particular episode with John Bunker, because this is what John is all about, is finding these apples in these, roadways across northern Maine and New England, and then getting other people basically addicted to it too. It's just so satisfying when you're saying, like it's blossom time and there's an apple tree, and being able to like be a detective of sorts in the best kind of way, because it's so, I mean, I could go on and on about it, right? Full circle, cool, like it brings all these like factors together from eating. You're going to get some good ideas here with this conversation with John. So thank you so much for telling us a bit about your journey. Keep us posted. I can't wait to hear how it keeps on moving forward in the years to come. And thank you so much for supporting Cider Chat via the Cider Chat Patreon page. You too can be a patron. Just Google Cider Chat Patreon. That's spelled Patreon. January 31st through February 3rd is CiderCon. This is hosted by the American Cider Association. It's their annual trade conference and the place to be if you are in the cider trade. Now, I know there are listeners out there who are not in the cider trade, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't understand a little bit about CiderCon, because, one thing kind of feeds to the other. Take, for instance, some of the workshops that are taking place. One in particular is all about carbonation. Now, from a consumer level, you think carbonation, like what's the big deal? But come on, all of us have opened up a bottle or a can that has been super, super fizzy, and it's as if the bubbles when you're drinking, they are abrasive on your throat, and you're like, what up with this? Like, I don't like that. That's too harsh. That's why the topic of carbonation has its own stand-alone workshop. And in that, makers learn the different methods for carbonation, the taxes around that. I mean, something cool for consumers to know is that the feds go around and they test carbonation levels in bottles, kind of like arbitrary. From what I heard, right? I'm not a commercial maker, so I don't know, but I hear they'll go around and actually test the carbonation level. And if you're too high, you get fined. And that is not a fun thing. So this is a really key workshop for makers to take. A guide to cider carbonation methods. Now, I know that sounds really, really techy, and there are workshops that are very, very techy. There's also ones that are all about tasting. Those sessions that are about tasting, you need to sign up and get tickets, because some of them are already selling out. So you want to get in on this, whether you are in the cider trade, you are cider curious, perhaps you're thinking about becoming a cidery. So you're in that startup phase. And maybe not this year, but think about this for next year. If you are an enthusiast, you could join the American Cider Association and attend CiderCon and help volunteer to get this event rolling along seamlessly throughout the week, because it always feels, in my mind, really seamless. It's a fun time to attend, January 31st through the 3rd. Find out all the info at ciderassociation.org. The day after CiderCon ends, still in Chicago on February 4th, is Chicago Cider Summit. And that is a 2-session tasting taking place at the Navy Pier. And I am going to be there at both sessions, and I will be live streaming conversations. And, well, not just conversations, because in the first session, between 1 to 2, we're going to be doing the final competition for the high pour, like the Cider high pour that they do in Asturias, where you hold the bottle over your head and you hold the cap down in front, down by your groin, basically, and you're not supposed to look at it. You just look forward and you pour the glass, the cider into the glass. That competition will be going live with that. at the Cider Summit. And then we'll be having different conversations with specifically women in the trade. So that's going to be super cool. The first session takes place from 1 to 2. That'll be live stream. And then from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. The live streaming will be available to watch in real time at the Cider Chat YouTube channel. Or you could look at it later, and hopefully it'll be good, so I will keep it up. But if anybody looks wiggy or something like that, I will definitely take it down because, look, my vanity is of the utmost importance. Anywho, that's going to be live streaming at the Cider Chat YouTube channel. Oh, I find myself so funny. I do kind of dread this podcaster dread of live streaming. I just did a live stream this past week called Bottles on My Desk, which is something I've wanted to do for a while because, it goes with the territory of being a cider podcaster and a craft beer writer. There's often a lot of bottles on my desk. And we went through 3 different tastings. And so that is still up at the Cider Chat YouTube channel, a little 20-minute video. I'm thinking about doing that again this week. It might even be tonight when this podcast goes live. On what day is that? That's going to be 18th of January. And so that could be happening live, be a shorter Bottles on My Desk thing. I'm just playing with the live streaming and having fun. But anyways, Cider Summit is taking place in Chicago, February 4th. There's still tickets available. There's a VIP tasting where you get to go in early because I'll tell you, that place gets packed and happening. It's just a ton of fun. You could go online now at cidersummit.com and see the list of makers that are going to be pouring there. It's going to be a fun time. I'll be up on the stage. If you see me, definitely come up and say hi. It's going to be so amazing to be just live streaming and in the groove. Once again, we are flooding the streets of Chicago with cider. Dancing in the streets. Up next, we're going to hear from our sponsor at the New York International Cider Competition, which is taking place February 18th.
Hey there, it's Adam Levy, the alcohol professor.
Adam, who should enter the New York International Cider Competition? Are you looking specifically for folks who have been long-term cider makers, or how about new folks entering the market, new startup cidery?
To be honest, we're the big tent. We want everybody, as long as you're commercially produced. You do not have to be sold in New York. You do not have to be sold in the United States to be in our competition. Around 15 to 18% who are not even sold in the United States enter our competition because they want to get in front of buyers at a blind taste test by category and by price. So again, it's open to established cider producers who've been doing it for many years, who want to get back in front of buyers in a blind taste test, as well as new producers who want to be discovered and find a new distributor and find a new retail store to work with them. So again, it's open to all cider producers, as long as you're commercially produced.
What is the particular benefit of entering the New York International Cider Competition that you see for cider makers? Is there a key reason why you think that this particular competition is worth entering?
Our cider competition is unique, like all of our competitions, because all our judges are trade buyers. And we're judging the product by its category and by its price, as if they were buying it for their business. Whether they're a cider bar, distributor, a retailer, they're buying for their business. So for a producer, it allows them to be blind tasted by top buyers and be discovered or rediscovered. So we have established brands who want to get back in front of buyers in a blind taste test to say, yes, we're still great at this price, and allows new producers who are not discovered yet to get in front of these buyers. And it's available to anyone who's commercially produced. You don't have to be sold in New York. You can be sold anywhere in the world as long as it's commercially produced. Around 15 to 18% who enter our competition are not even sold in the United States. They're importers, producers overseas who want to get into the U.S. market, as well as producers, from California, from Texas, from Oklahoma, who also want to be in this market.
Thanks, Adam. We'll talk to you next week. And for those makers out there, commercial makers, that is, entering this competition, make sure to use the following promo code CHAT23 for $10 off your entries. Just go to nycidercompetition.com. Up next is John Bunker, who is an apple historian and apple detective, an author, the founder of FEDCO Trees, and so much more. He's going to be talking about the Maine Heritage Orchard, which was essentially built in a gravel pit. So that's a story unto itself, and he will be talking about that. And the subtitle of this speech is The Successes and Challenges Over the First 10 Years. So this is spot on for anyone who loves Maine, loves apples, and is wondering, like, how do you get something like this done? What is the backstory? Also the backstory of the Maine Organic Gardeners and Farmers Association, also known as MAFGA. You can look them up at mafga.org. All the links will be in the show notes. That beginning, John's part that he plays in there, the apprenticeships that happen, talking about volunteers, and also the money part of these systems for doing this kind of reclamation of land and also preservation of specific varieties that are just treasures from our landscape over the years. So we're going to go to this presentation shortly. I just want you to know this was recorded outside. He had his back to the lake. He was speaking to this outside amphitheater of people. And next week, you're going to be hearing the Q&A from this very conversation. So he opened it to the audience, and that alone is worth hearing for many reasons. But we'll save that for next week's episode. Right now, just focus in on this one because it is a doozy. Once again, here is John Bunker.
I moved to the countryside here in Maine when I was 21 and soon became enamored with the apples. I wanted to collect them, like many of you. I learned about grafting and began to graft everything that I could find. At first, I was completely indiscriminate in what I collected, but it soon became really clear to me that I was going to run out of room very quickly. So I decided that I needed a way of focusing my efforts. About that time, so this would be about 45 years ago, I began to learn that Maine, like all apple growing regions, had its own unique assortment of historic apple varieties. Not only that, I began to learn that Maine had varieties that were rarely and sometimes never grown anywhere else. And many of these old Maine apples were on the verge of being lost forever. On top of that, very few people back then, so this was, as I said, the late 70s, early 80s, very few people, even the old-timers, could identify the old Maine varieties. That was how fast this knowledge was lost. So my parents' generation, my parents were born in the early 1920s. By then, a lot of the old culture of the farms and the orchards had already been lost. So I decided that my job would be to save the old Maine apples for future generations, and that gave me my focus. For the next several decades, I collected rare Maine apples and preserved them on our farm in Waldo County, about an hour east of here. And I was able to find ancient apples throughout the state. And I had a 7-pronged strategy for finding old apples. And it worked. One is to seek out mentors. And I had some really great ones. They're all dead now, so you can't have them. But and they were mostly old men, but we lived in a sexist culture back then, and that was just the way it worked. But some women as well. So that was number one. Number two was to do cold calls anytime I see old apples by the side of the road. So I had to put aside my fear and just knock on the door. And I've done that in some places that people with me wouldn't even go up the driveway. But I found that people are just so accommodating, so generous. I've had a couple of people tell me to get out, but that was really only maybe 2 or 3 in 40 years. The next thing, I introduced myself as, "Hi, I'm John Bunker. you might not believe this, but of all things, I'm an apple historian. And of course, that would almost immediately disarm them. And they would think, who is this person? But it usually led to some really good things. The next thing was to give talks at historical societies, garden clubs, church groups, no matter how small the group, and essentially charge nothing, or else say to them, I want you to pay me what you can within your budget, and I have a sliding scale of $1 million down to zero, and a sort of corollary of that is that I would whenever I give a talk still, but especially then, what I would do is I would try to learn. I didn't want to give the same talk every time. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One is that I felt like giving a new talk every time, and of course some things, if you're giving a talk about apples, you've got to explain grafting. A lot of people, that they didn't even know about grafting and so forth. So there's things that you have to talk about. But I felt like it kept me fresh to do something different, a bit of a twist or a whole different thing each time. Often I would focus on an apple that originated in that county or that town or whatever. And also I feel like if you do the same old thing every time, I think that the people who are listening to you, whether they've ever heard you speak or not, they're going to know. They're going to know that you're just spouting off something that you've memorized, which I think is lesser, we'll say. Also to pass, so the next in my 7-pronged strategy, to pass out wanted posters. And maybe some of you have seen the wanted posters over at over on the table. There's a bunch of them there. You should take them if you want. And that was really fun to do, and I write about it in my book. But it really does help, and it has helped with some of the discoveries that we've made over the years. And I try to. Well, a wanted poster is going to be valuable if it's where variety X or variety Y, whatever you're looking for, was originally either where it originated or where it was typically grown. Also, that I would go to fairs and events and do lots of them, mostly Common Ground Fair, but I've been to many other fairs too, and that I would do a display of apples when I went to a fair, so or an event, and it's like a magnet, And at first, I just went out and got whatever apples I could find and set them out on a table, and some I didn't even know the names of, and all instantly I could see that people see it. People are walking by and they're talking with their friend, and they look out of the corner of their eyes and they see it, and they just like veer off and come and visit you. And lastly, to do Apple IDs at no charge. And I have charged a few times, and some people send bribes. They send chocolate or whatever in the box. I've gotten all sorts of fun gifts, but for the most part, I do it for nothing. And the reason why I do it for nothing is that I felt like, and still feel like, that a lot of the people who I want, this is a way. I mean, it's an unbelievable service that they're providing, because they are finding apples and getting them to you at no work on your part, except that you need to try to identify them. So we found some just fantastic stuff because people send us apples, and I've had really hundreds of apples sent to me over the years. So anyway, during this time, this early period in 1984, I started FEDCO Trees. And that turned out to be a great venue for saving apples. So I would graft my varieties that I found onto a branch at our farm. And so some of our trees wound up with 10, 12 varieties on a tree. The farm became a library for tasting, studying, photographing, and so forth. And also enabled me to generate cyanwood to graft sellable quantities through FEDCO. And my strategy for preserving historic varieties became to get them out into the public, get people growing them again, which is still what I really think is very important. The catalog sales strategy worked pretty well, but it does have its drawbacks. Homeowners lose the name tags, they move away, they forget to prune off root suckers, all this stuff they don't put on tree guards, they forget to look for borers, and so forth and so on. So over time, we might sell a few dozen, several hundred, or even thousands of a rare variety, but has the variety actually been saved? I was also running out of room at our place. We have a farm that's carved out of the woods, and there's no stone walls where we live, so it was never farmland. So growing 10 and 12 varieties on a tree is fun, but it's not great for the trees. And over time, I've seen that certain varieties will take over the tree, and certain varieties will die off, and you could also import a virus with one variety, and then that infects the whole tree, and So I needed space enough to grow single trees of each variety. There have been many apple collections around the U.S. and around the world over the centuries. The vast majority have been privately owned and privately funded. And the vast majorities of those collections fade away with the death or disappearance of the owners. This is a big issue. I mean, the largest collection, the largest private collection in the world probably was Nick Botner's in Southern Oregon. And a bunch of people in the Portland area have been trying to save it by moving everything up to Portland through grafting, but it's fraught with all sorts of problems. And after Nick died, and he was a really remarkably wonderful guy. I went there twice and visited with him and spent a bunch of time there. But these private collections, although admirable and they provide a great service, they're not, from my point of view, they're not a sustainable way of saving plant material. Anyway, we considered purchasing a small piece of good farmland near us, my wife and I, and starting a sort of a Maine Heritage Orchard on our property. But in the end, I decided to attempt a partnership with MAFCA, Maine Farmers and Gardeners, MAFCA. I did know that public institutions also have their challenges, and it would not be easy to do this. But if carefully organized and adequately funded, such a collection would be secure long after my own lifetime. That's what I wanted. So a small group of us at MAFCA put together a plan. At first we called it the Maine Educational Heritage Orchard, MEHO, M-E-H-O, and later shortened it just to the Maine Heritage Orchard, MHO. So we had two goals originally. First was to protect and preserve our expanding collection of rare historic Maine tree fruit varieties. This would allow us to dispense fruit and scionwood to those interested in varietal preservation, commercial orcharding, and even breeding of the apples of the future. And the rare genetic material would be safe. The second goal would be to research innovative, sustainable, orchard-related practices, including opportunities for researching food growing in sustainable mixed polycultures, and then all the educational stuff, workshops and teaching people how to graft and prune and so forth and so on. So we had our two goals, and now we just needed a plot of land. So MAFCA, in the period before the sort of current period, there was for a long time a really wonderful, smart, beloved man named Russell Libby, who was the executive director for about 15 years. And during his tenure, he was the one who spearheaded the sort of movement to Unity, where the current campus facility is. And then once he got there, he started to buy up, with the help, obviously, of generous funders, land adjacent to the original plot at MAFCA. And he did that for a number of reasons. One is to protect farmland and also for parking for the fair, because if you've ever been to the fair, there's 60,000 people over a weekend. And one of the pieces of land that he bought, or that Mofka bought during that period, about 20 years ago, had a abandoned gravel pit on it that no one was doing anything with, and that he and Mofka felt like it should be renovated. And so he said to me, and Russell died 10 years ago, but before he died, he and I had many, many conversations about all this. And he suggested that we do the orchard in the gravel pit. So we decided to situate the orchard there, and subsequently had a third goal, which would be to renovate an abandoned Maine gravel pit, of which there are hundreds, by modeling biological methods for the remediation of damaged soil and the restoration of resilient and productive ecosystems. We would transform this gravel pit into an apple orchard. This would be uncharted territory, as we knew of no one doing this type of work. So now a little bit of a backtrack to 1999. In 1999, we planted 2 smaller orchards right on the site of the Common Ground Fair, and if you've been there, you know them. One is called the North Orchard, which features about 40 apple varieties that originated in Maine. And our goal for the Heritage Orchard was varieties that originated in Maine and varieties that were grown historically here, but not necessarily originated here. And all these 40 varieties were pretty much endangered and rare. And then in the South Orchard, the second plot up there, we had several dozen modern and heirloom apples, pears, plums, cherries, peaches, so forth, on multiple rootstocks as sort of a demonstration to what fairgoers and the public might be interested in doing in their own yard. Both orchards were located where Mofka visitors and fairgoers could study and appreciate them, and educational workshops were regularly held using those orchards as learning laboratories. So we had a model. So in October 2012, the Mofka Board of Directors voted unanimously to establish the Maine Heritage Orchard, a 10-acre preservation orchard. And in the next summer, 2013, with the assistance of members of the Maine permaculture community, we staked out and then created about 20 contoured terraces of various lengths sculpted into the hillside of the first 3 acres of the pit. For several days, we had some big machines doing the earthwork, and when it was done, it reminded me of sort of like Peru or Vietnam, though I've never been to either. But it wouldn't be potatoes or rice. It would be apples and many other plants. This would be a polyculture preservation orchard. We marked out 102 spots and fertilized each location with a pile of rock powders and compost. That was October 2013. We had, in anticipation of this, we had begun grafting 2 years earlier in hopes that this would all happen. So in 2014, in April, we planted the first 100+ varieties. We also then immediately, and then over the course of the next months and years, we planted hundreds of companion plants, including both woody and herbaceous plants, and ground covers in between the trees to improve the soil, attract and support pollinators, and over time attempt to establish a balanced ecosystem. Each year since then, more trees and companions have been added. Once the bulk of our discoveries were planted, so at first we had this sort of like the low-hanging fruit. We had the Baldwins and Northern Spies and Winter Bananas and Tolman Sweets and so forth. And then once we got all them planted, then we have reached a period where now we plant about a dozen or two of our most recent and like really rare stuff that we're discovering. So we're adding 10 or 20 varieties a year now. After originally the first 2 or 3 years, it was about 100 varieties a year. Recently, currently the bulk of the crew's work, and Lauren, why don't you just wave your hand? Lauren is somebody I've worked with for many, many years, both at my farm and elsewhere, and she's one of the crew now, one of the most knowledgeable people about companion plants and balanced ecosystems and so forth, really in the state. The bulk of the crew's work now is in maintaining the nearly 500 trees and managing the fruit crop, and it's a huge amount of work. Recently, we've also been DNA profiling our entire collection in collaboration with Cameron Peace at Washington State University. And we've gotten to know Cameron quite well. He's going to come to Common Ground Fair. He is just a wonderful, delightful human being, very knowledgeable. We send foliage, so we don't send fruit, we send foliage, little teeny leaves in desiccant to him, and then he sends them off, and they're burned up, and then they come back with what they call a DNA profile, and that is compared to what they call a reference panel, which is the apples that they have already, they hope, they've identified and accurately identified, and then if it's a comparison, we know what the variety is or a synonym of it for what we found in Maine, and if not, the ones that come back what they call, unique or unique unknown or whatever, they could be a seedling that we've discovered and thought it was grafted, but might not be. But they also could be these rare Maine apples that originated here that we know about, many of them because of old literature, like that book, the Apple Varieties in Maine by Bradford. We think in some ways that when we get our results back and it says unique unknown or no match or whatever, those are the ones that really excite us, because those are the ones that could be something that we've been on the search for. So how is this all organized? So the initial arrangement with MOFGA's board of directors gave the orchard operational autonomy and financial independence. Not wanting to drain on the MOFGA staff and budget, and this was partly from us and partly from them, we decided that the orchard would operate under the guidance of a volunteer committee supervised by a staff member, create its own budget, and raise all its own money. Do what you can and pay as you go. The goal was to get the varieties planted and protected while continuing to renovate the pit. Paid staff, barns, multi-million-dollar visitor centers, all that would have to wait. So for the first few years, basically, I raised all the money, and I'm not a fundraiser, and I'm not a staff member of MOFGA. I was on the board of directors and have done a lot with MOFGA over the years, but this was like way out of my league. But I did have some friends that had a little money, and they would send, some of them, sent like $5,000 or $10,000, which was just incredible. One time I was at a party, and I was all right around all this stuff happening, and I bumped into an acquaintance who said, what are you up to? And there's like people everywhere, And I said, well, I'm doing this thing, and blah blah blah. And then like 4 days later, I get a call from this guy who had never even been to my house. I barely knew him, and he said, my wife and I have been thinking about your orchard, and we think you need a fence. So how much would a fence be? And I said, well, it'll be about $25,000. And he said, okay, yeah, we'll buy you a fence. So you got to put yourself out there, and, people may respond. So another thing that happened was right in the early stages that at one point the board of directors said to us, we couldn't start this unless we endowed the whole thing forever. And we're like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? So Russell, the executive director friend of mine, and I went and visited some people who could have probably funded, all of your projects, whatever you're doing, they could have funded all together in one check. And they invited us down, and they live in a big, one of these palaces on the coast of Maine, and but really nice people. And I had done some apple identification work for free for them. And so they said, well, what are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. What do you want to do? And we told them and everything. And they said, well, how much do you want? And we're like, you know. So we gave them a figure, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. And, uh, and, and they said, well, but do you want some advice? And we said, sure, we'll take advice. And they said, and they said, do it. Just start doing it. Whatever you can raise, get out there with your shovels and start planting trees. Don't worry about an endowment. Just do it. And eventually people are going to see what you're doing, and they're going to see the goodness of what you're doing, and they will give you money, support what you're doing. And of course, I mean, an example of that was the guy, a month or two later who gave us the fence. But the other thing they did say is, eventually, you need to endow this. And 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 as you can imagine, if you think about it, an organization like MOFCO, which does have some income but not a lot, is hugely expensive to run. I mean, there's a lot of staff, there's infrastructure, there's buildings, blah blah blah, and so endowing something like an orchard, or I mean, that's why colleges spend all that time, obviously, trying to endow because it's just so expensive to run these nonprofits. Eventually, we realized too that we had to have a staff. That for the first 2 or 3 years, it did work out pretty well just doing it as volunteers. And we had volunteer days. We'd plant the trees, and we'd get like 40 people come and plant trees. We'd have 100 trees planted in 45 minutes or something. It was really great, but I was still working full time at FEDCO. Other primary volunteers, Todd is a full-time teacher at College of the Atlantic, and people had jobs and people had lives, and you can do this work as volunteers, but ultimately, especially if you're going to get beyond a certain scale, you really have to have, I would say, you have to have a staff. And so at a certain point, we realized we were going to have to do that too. So we hired an orchard manager, and the first orchard manager is Laura, who is here this weekend and who is still the orchard manager. And eventually, we also hired different assistants, and right now, Lauren and Logan are our two primary assistants. We also originally promised that we wouldn't use any MOFCA office staff, but of course that's changed now too. And so we're very thankful and appreciative and reliant upon the office staff as well. Volunteers still play an important role in what we do, but it's relatively minor compared to the value and the importance of the paid staff. So what have been our successes? Well, we've preserved nearly 500 apples and pears historically grown in Maine, and we've got them all in one central location for preservation, propagation, research, efficient DNA testing, observation. Many of the varieties we've saved would be gone forever if it was not for our work. And we know that because now, having done this long, I can, usually if I see a new apple or somebody brings me something, I can tell if I've ever seen it before. And we're frequently finding stuff that we haven't seen before. And also some of my favorite and some of others of the staff's favorite cultivars, varieties that we've saved, we go back to the original trees, they're gone. So a lot of this work, if it wasn't for us, they'd be gone already. And we've spread awareness of the importance of this work and generated, I think, a lot of excitement, which is, really valuable. This is not just about Maine. It's not just about, our own personal favorites. This is about, getting you all involved in your own way wherever you are. We've also created good employment for our small Heritage Orchard crew. One of the things that I think many nonprofits struggle with is is the role of volunteers versus the role of staff. And some people at MOFGA have traditionally sort of like wanted less staff. And my opinion is that actually creating jobs for people who love plants is a good thing. And so maybe it's the role of sort of capital T, capital V, the volunteer, as a nonprofit develops, the role of the volunteer morphs. It's still important, but this is like really great that an organization like MOFGA now has, I don't know how many employees. Lauren, do you know, 40, 50? Obviously most are not involved with the Heritage Orchard, but there's like a lot of people that MOFGA employs on really excellent work, and that's really valuable. We've created a group of really dedicated Maine fruit explorers who are now working with us one way or another, directly or indirectly. A bunch of them are here. Sean Turley is a good example, who many of you know who he is. When I started doing this, I was doing it in really relative isolation. And now there's there's a whole bunch of us, and it's really great. We've also established a network of what we call Heritage Orchard stewards. And those are people like any of you who can buy a copy, so to speak, a clone of one of our rare varieties, grow it in your yard, and then you are providing research opportunities for that variety. It may not even have a name yet. We may not even know what it is. We might just call it the Kawasaki green or something, or number 48235, but it's from an ancient tree. It's also a backup. It means that if our tree dies at the Heritage Orchard, we've got yours that we can get propagation wood off of. We've been able to experiment with a holistic spray regimen and trial all sorts of organic management practices that might be too costly to do at home, or even at that might not be worth doing in a commercial orchard yet. We've hosted dozens of volunteer opportunities and probably hundreds at this point of educational classes around apple preservation, orcharding, grafting, pruning, many at MOFGA, but also all over the state. And we've learned a lot about reclamation of degraded land in our attempt to transform this gravel pit into a biologically diverse ecosystem. So what have our major challenges been? Well, we faced some big ones. The dual, I'm going to read this part, but I'll try to explain. The dual combination of land reclamation and fruit preservation has been particularly difficult. In hindsight, the two projects, fixing the pit and preserving rare apple varieties, might have been better if we'd kept it separate. In particular, the most endangered of our collection should be planted in good soil in an easily managed location. So we have at our home now, my wife and I have multiple orchards, and one of our orchards has about 300 trees. Some are historic, some are seedlings. There are apples from all over the world, species from all over the world, and they're set in rows, and they're set about 15 feet apart, even though most of them are on standards. We can go through and do the work that we do with those 300 apples in about a tenth the time that the orchard crew at MOFGA can do them on those terraces. It's just really time consuming. And so having especially the really super valuable, which really means the super rare endangered ones, what we're thinking that we will do, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but we're thinking that we should plant out an additional section of our orchard at MOFGA that will be the most endangered stuff in a much more accessible kind of system. The gravel pit restoration work is incredibly valuable and important, but the challenges of the terraces and the poor soil. So you can imagine also the topsoil, any topsoil there was in that pit was gone like 60 years ago. And so we were planting on super, super poor soil. And we've done a lot to improve it, but the challenges of the terraces and the poor soil have put some of our most valuable plant material at unnecessary risk. So they are really two different projects that can be done together, but not necessarily. Another challenge has been relying on volunteer help is great for many activities, but oversight on quality control can be difficult with large groups. So for preserving the historic varieties, we want to make sure, especially when you're really in danger of losing stuff, that you have trained staff involved. And also that one of the things that I've learned from other nonprofits, in particular, I don't know if any of you heard of the Food Project, which is in the Boston area, where my wife worked many years. They have, and I think MOFGA could use some help with this, is to have a volunteer day be about, we'll say 60% educational and 40% work. So one of the things that Food Project does so well is they have they actually have groups that pay to come volunteer. Like the lawyer firm that wants to do community work once a year. So they get 40 lawyers and they all come out and they get a lesson in organic agriculture, and then they work for 3 hours and they still get a lot done, but they learn a lot, and also they don't weed the carrots instead of the weeds, or whatever. So we need to be better. We need to work better at how we integrate the sort of educational piece with the volunteer piece. We also need to spend more time on documentation. So at first, and still a lot of what I did is on, it's sort of documented. I mean, I have records, and some are lost, and some are on scraps of paper still, and whatever. And the documentation, if you're going to begin to do any kind of work, whether it's breeding new varieties or preserving old varieties or anything, it's going to be the documentation that sets you aside from the person that sticks a tree in their backyard. And putting a tree in your backyard is really fun. It's really good. It's still connecting you with plants and all that. But what sets the work that we're doing aside, and the work that a lot of you are doing, is the documentation. Okay, so this works, this doesn't work, this is really great. You should plant this variety. Well, why should you plant this variety? Well, that comes in the documentation, and it's very expensive and really time-consuming. And we could practically, in our Heritage Orchard, have one person who is practically year-round doing documentation. Or maybe there would be, we have the staff of 3, maybe each one of the 3, rather than have somebody stuck inside, my friends who all got PhDs in agriculture and then they hated it. They call it their green card as your PhD in agriculture, and you sit in a laboratory in a basement somewhere and look at a microscope. It's like, why am I doing this? So maybe what we do is have everybody, maybe we have a staff of 3, a staff of 5, whatever, and all of them are involved at one time or another in the documentation work. Raising the necessary funds to pay the staff and the other expenses is a huge, huge task. And the government, they're we could say they're building bombs or whatever, but that's a little too cynical. Although maybe they are. But we did try to partner with the state of Maine, and they have been in some ways extremely helpful. But for a while, there's a really great place. If you live in Maine, you should go there, called Highmore Farm, which is in Monmouth, which is the state ag experiment farm. It's not like Geneva. If you haven't been there, you gotta go. But it's out of this world. But Highmore Farm is a good place, and they gave me 2 or 3 rows, 4 or 5 rows of dwarf trees. That was a trial, and they were done with them. And they said, take these, graft whatever you want onto them. And I thought, this was before the Heritage Orchard, long before. And I thought, oh, this is awesome. So I took all my, rare material, and apprentices came over with me, and we grafted all this stuff. And it was like, this is awesome. And then the orchard manager at Highmore Farm retired, or moved away or something. They got a new guy, and I got an email from them saying, well, we have a new orchard manager, and he wants to put in a raspberry trial or something, whatever, where your trees are. So sorry, we're going to cut them all down. And so that was the end of that. And that was like 5 years down the drain. So relying on the state, relying on the government, somewhere out there, as we know, there are people who do have the funds and who are concerned about this kind of thing, and we want to find them over time. People who are interested in agriculture, agricultural history, and the future of the planet. And we hope that this will change, and that over time, people who can help us will step up to the plate. Then to go back to the beginning, if you want to do it, just start it, because that's where you can't wait, for the money. So the future, well, we've been making more discoveries every year. Although the old Maine trees are dying off, there are still varieties yet to be found. They're tucked in behind old barns, along old stone walls, sometimes looking out from overgrown pastures. They've typically shed their large limbs, and new trunks are growing from what were once branches, and so forth and so on. But they have been through multiple test winters, diseases, droughts, bugs, decades of neglect, and still they've hung in there. These are rugged trees, and they almost certainly, many of them, possess valuable genetics for the future. It's a race against time. The trees will often live to be about 100, maybe sometimes at max 200. 150 years takes us back to 1870, and that was the waning years of this period of great orchard diversity. And if we're going to save the old trees, the time is now. So some of our goals: develop long-term stable support for the paid orchard staff, and raise an endowment to ensure that MAFCA can care for these apples, this project in perpetuity, and establish a program of paid interns. We do have some interns, some even this year, some they're here actually at Maine Apple Camp, and eventually build an orchard infrastructure. We probably should have a barn someday, and maybe a research lab, maybe an educational, maybe a classroom or something, whatever, fruit storage. Those are sort of no-brainers. Continue to collaborate on genetics work. Continue to expand and deepen our research and documentation into Maine apples. I talked about that. This is some of the really super fun stuff, is collaborate with other groups doing similar work around the country. So Todd and I, and Laura in particular, are involved in different Zoom groups. Some of the people, we've never met them, but now we know them really well, I guess, because we see them. We see their smiling faces on Zoom once a week or every other week. And so Dan Bussey is here somewhere. He's not here right now, but he's here this weekend. He's one of the people on that group. Other people, you might know their names, but people from all around the country are concerned in their, it's sort of like think globally, act locally, another cliche, but it's true. And they're doing really interesting work in different little spots around the country, and we're trying to work with all of them and want to continue and to expand that. And assist other groups in creating heritage orchards. One of the things that always kind of made me smile about when I was doing FEDCO, because I'm pretty much retired now, is people would write to me from, wherever, Iowa or something, I'm picking on Iowa, and say, we want to grow Maine apples. And I think, well, you know what? Although I want you to buy our product, that was my business, what I really want you to do is grow Iowa apples, So this has never been about like, even though obviously Maine apples are the best, but but this has never been about Maine apples. This is about your apples. This is about your place. I was talking about apples teach us about place. It is about your place, and that's there should be like peach collections in Texas or pecan collections or whatever, and I think there probably are. But that's what we want. We want these kinds of organizations everywhere. We want to expand and train our exploration team. We know that we're missing a lot of stuff. If some of you want to join us, wherever you live, whether it's in Maine or not, but especially in Maine, we want your help, and we want to work with you. It's really fun work. I mean, it's incredibly fun work. We also want to expand the number of people who can identify apples. They call it phenotypically, from the visual, from the apple itself, and that is very difficult to do, but it is a learnable skill. Last but not least, we want to keep Maine Apple Camp going forever.
We definitely want Maine Apple Camp going forever. Thank you so much, John Bunker. There'll be links in the show notes to this year episode 352 at ciderchat.com. That will be able to connect you with MAFCA and the Maine Apple Camp, and of course, John Bunker. And definitely check out the Maine Heritage Orchard. Make it in your planning book and a priority to go check out this amazing orchard. More on that next week with John Bunker returning to Cider Chat. In fact, I have a number of recordings with John. You just got to get these recordings while you can because it's such a treasure trove of info. I mean, think about it. He has those years. He has the insight that you coming into it, if you are like 20-something and you have an affection for apples, you want to lean on these folks who've been through the trials. They see it in a certain way, and that's what really delivers. It's absolutely fascinating. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I did producing and editing this episode for you. If you got some value from this podcast after listening this long, please do consider becoming a patron of Cider Chat. Just go to the Cider Chat Patreon page, it's spelled Patreon, or go to ciderchat.com and hit the donate button today. And with that, I leave you here. This is Ria Windcaller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
Like cider, we like ponds, we love orchards and having fun. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes there is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. We like cider, we like ponds, we like orchards, having some fun. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes there is. There is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. We like cider. Oh yes we do. We like ponds. Oh yes we do. We love orchards, having some fun. There is a reason why we do it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. There's a reason why we do it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da-dum. We like walking down the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. like cider.
Ba-da-da-dum.
We like palms.
Oh, yes, we do.
We like orchards, having some fun. Yeehaw!